So this is 07:15 GMT and 08:15 UK local time on Thursday, the 15th of October 2020. This is part A of the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street of today by the KhoodeelaarTV campaign and by the movement defending the community in the East End of London and defending the universal values from the East End of London. And this is to say that we have been doing this for the last 3 months, 3.5 months almost. And before this, we have been publishing on the internet on about 200 separate accounts by the movement defending the community in the East End of London. The evidence of our original investigative campaigning work has been shared with no paywalls, not charging anyone anything, except to share the universal truth and values for the benefit of all genuine campaigners and supporters of justice, campaign for justice and rights and defense of the environment and universal human rights and of all the animals and creatures on the planet. And the idea behind this particular platform and activity includes the defense of those aspects of society and social or society-based activities that are not covered by the normal standard basic newspapers, which as we have been saying, is typified by the Times, the title Times, the Daily Universal Record, or whatever it was called at the start 200 plus years ago when it was started. Now it is not universal anymore, as we have diagnosed and dissected the complete stupidity of the Times as it is currently edited in its endorsing yesterday in the first editorial, the elected mayor bureaucracy, which it said mea culpa is a kind of pun on the mea culpa. So it is something that we are very concerned about, not because just one issue. Universally taken together, the whole of the UK currently is being ill-served or not being served at all when it comes to the truth, the information, and the basic evidence and the basic service that the people need, not ask for only, but need, as was the case when the advocates of the National Health Service, the founders advocates of the National Health Service, made sure to say that health care and service should be provided and available to everyone at the point of need, regardless of the means, whether they can or could pay for the service or the care or not. It didn't matter. Point of need was the universal value. And that is something that has not been advocated and advanced in the decades since the foundation of the NHS. And this model has been partially adopted by other countries, especially including Sweden. And most of the countries that have adopted it have actually done it more honestly than the controllers of the resource of the finance, the fiscal kind of allocators of money and resources in the UK have been doing. And the controllers have been, in the last 7 decades, mainly people of the Conservative Party, which has included more opponents of the idea of a National Health Service than it has included supporters. The supporters have been very few and far between, but that is very scarce, very small number. And any reference by Boris Johnson, the current kind of frontier of the cabal that is in power, so-called, or in occupation of the positions of power. Anyone watching this, please notice the language that I have been using, the phrases and clarifiers. Every intended kind of clarifier is intended to clarify and distinguish what we say, I say, from the other kind of uses or abuses. For example, when we say the point of need and the idea of National Health Service, that is intended to distinguish between the practice and the reality and the intended aims and objects. What is happening on the ground with the NHS because of the pandemic and the pandemonium, that is the mess, the disorganization, the dysfunction, and the incompetence and the failure to apply the resources that are available in society, in the economy, and in the country to helping the people who need the best and the most kind of appropriate care in the circumstances that they are there in. Not only about the pandemic, about the infection and about the virus, but also generally applying to other kind of chronic illnesses and the long-ranging illnesses that people suffer and have been suffering. Any student, that is to say, anyone who has been systematically, objectively studying the data and the statistics about the NHS in this country, that is the National Health Service, would know that the first thing that features in any public kind of comment and commentary about the NHS is about the lack of resources on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is wasteful. Those who don't want the idea of the NHS to be established, to get sort of established credibly, are the ones who say that there is a lot of waste. And those who do want the NHS to succeed, the idea of the NHS to succeed, say that there is not enough resources, which is factually true. Now, the other side, the waste kind of blamers, have also got about 10% of the truth on their side. 90% they exaggerate, but 10% is true. That is a lot of waste. But the most important problem with the NHS, in my study over the decades, is that the NHS has been sabotaged by vested interests who have been given impunity within the NHS system, which is the kind of serial groups of consultants, doctors who have got a club of consultants, and they over-exploit and overly loot and rob and starve the NHS of the resources that are very, very scarce and very important. And the fourth point, in the context of the kind of evidence in the last 9 months of the disproportionately large number, high numbers of people from African and Asian origin, and especially Muslims, dying in care homes and other places with the infection. That context brings into play the need to have the National Health Service, whatever provision there is, under active, ongoing 24/7 audit and monitoring, so that those who are prejudiced racially or because of faith, prejudice against faith, can be prevented, stopped from abusing their position and murdering people. Imagine when somebody is seriously ill and they are at the disposal, at the hands of the person that are treating them and making life and death decision. What power, what force? They haven't got any force whatsoever to stop that person killing them with the injection or whatever. A lethal dose. And lethal dosage in the NHS is not as strange and unknown as it may sound at first. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman is the serial murderer of hundreds of patients. Harold Shipman has been a GP for a long time, and he murdered hundreds of people. That is so far known. He might have murdered thousands of people over a very long career. So there is no actual audit process ongoing to prevent people with absolutely deadly and serious kind of powers at their hands, abusing those. So that's the general introduction to the values of the NHS and the need to prevent the NHS from disintegrating because of too many people dying in its, quote, care, which is not really caring, but doing the opposite. And all of these coming from the Khoodeelaar campaign, upholding the universal values, which is so important, because if you make things partisan, that is to say, if you say this is the Labour Party or this is the Conservative Party, then it becomes limited to those parties, and the objective truth and the evidence and the needs and the emergencies are not then reached, let alone being addressed in time, on time, and with the success in achieving saving of lives. That is the purpose of the health service. Otherwise, it could have been named the death service, National Death Service, which is how many people, many victims of the pandemic-related deaths in care homes and other places, and still unknown numbers of people who have been the victims of various stages of lack of care or deadly lack of care and deadly withdrawal of care. So these are the issues that need to be objectively, universally examined. The exchange yesterday, that is Wednesday, the 14th of October 2020, in the kind of half-deserted British House of Commons, between Boris Johnson, the occupant in the post of Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer, the opposition leader, that is the leader of the Labour Party as well. The exchanges can be taken as a classic illustration of how these PMQs and the exchanges on other occasions between the so-called two parties or among government and ministers, and on the one hand and the MPs from various sides, these exchanges are limited to partisan, that is to say party enforced kind of agendas. And that is not what these issues warrant and demand, because people are being killed unnecessarily. Nobody can be killed necessarily, but there is a phrase there. So too many people have been exposed to lack of care at various stages. And the Times newspaper, despite this Mayor Kalpa and the promotion of the agenda for more mayors, the Times newspaper is not publishing the truth. So the need for the truth about what is going on the ground is absolutely undeniable, and it's absolutely urgent. And what we have seen in the last 9 months is that the truth is not being told. And we have seen the evidence of the truth being denied and suppressed at every kind of, if you like, exchange. Every exchange that has happened, both in the House of Commons and also elsewhere in related kind of avenues and venues, and at platforms between the various parties or between the governing kind of party and the opposition, so-called. Those exchanges have been partisan. And the partisan approach has been kind of more prominent, more forced, and more emphatic, and more kind of dominating of the agenda than the approaches shown by the smaller parties like the Labour Party, the SNP, and the other smaller, very small parties like the Lib Dems and the Green Party, which has got only one MP, Caroline Lucas. So what we are saying is that we are looking at the papers, not just about this issue, but generally about society. And we are also setting an example in terms of the evidence that we are sharing. This is something that may seem like 1 hour program, every edition, about 1 hour. But behind this, underlying this, is the work of decades of work into the role, the orientation, the ownership, the control, the various dynamics, the various processes involved in the contents and the role of the what is called the mainstream media. This particular diagnosis is about the Fleet Street, but we also diagnose, if you notice, the role of the television mainstream, but we are not doing that as a dedicated kind of thing, item by item, like we are doing the newspapers, but we shall be doing separate programs or a separate kind of sections looking at the details of the role and the orientation and the impact and the implications of the broadcasting media, including radio and television, and also of the so-called social media. I say so-called because the social media is not social at all. It is actually captive in the hands of those who have the means and can control the agenda, especially highlighted by the corruption of the USA election in 2016 and the Brexit kind of referendum and its outcome via various operations that were carried out by the Facebook platform. One of the most kind of widely publicized outfit that has been associated with that is Cambridge Analytica. So the social media is not influential to the extent that it theoretically could be if Zuckerberg's statement on the Facebook that Facebook would always be free. That is absolute rubbish. How could that be kind of reconciled with the reality that Zuckerberg is one of the world's richest individuals? Where did he get that money if Facebook is free? So that is like that kind of lie, big lie, is staring us all in the face. And the point about the anti-social media or anti-social role of the social media, so-called, or social platforms, has to be democratically held to account for the benefit of democracy and the benefit of the people, regardless of what means they have, for the people to receive service at the point of need. So extrapolating that slogan, that definition that we have applied about the NHS, the point of need, has to be applied across the board in relation to all the services that people need at various times and for which societies or the governments exist and for which taxes are paid and for which the authority of the government in each jurisdiction is deemed to be acceptable because of the corollary, which is that the government therefore can serve the people and defend the people and protect the people. Protection of the citizen, whether it's citizen strictly defined or citizen as a resident in a territory, lawfully resident, the protection is always at issue. For example, in the USA, the last 2 weeks of kind of evidence that have come out through various media about the behavior of Donald Trump show that he has been responsible for letting hundreds of thousands of Americans die, be killed. And one of the commentators accessed in the last 24 hours from one of the outlets called the Young Turks has said that the USA is now a failing state. That's a very significant statement to make for an American person sitting in America and talking about the failures of the Trump misadministration in protecting the people, American people. And then he said that how many 9/11 would need to happen to reach that kind of number of casualties and deaths. That is also a very phenomenally significant statement. So just in context, we are talking about failing states and failure of these states and the states kind of usurper of state power, which is what Trump is seen as and has been seen as right from the beginning of the election, so-called, that he claims to have won in 2016. So in all of that, Facebook has played a part that has made the difference. The corruption and the criminality and the criminal gangs that have been operating through Facebook have been kind of playing defining roles in which party or which person wins what election, or if an election is held or not at all. And a lot of that has been happening in the African continent, as the various investigators have found the involvement of many of the British-based Brexiteers in American kind of events, but more importantly in African events, and African kind of democracy being sabotaged and subverted through the involvement of these criminal names who have remained to this day prosecuted, unarrested, despite the fact that there is absolutely massive evidence connecting them with all kinds of wrongdoings and criminality and illegality. And none of this, all the discussion that I have just had, or the presented, or given the summary of, is not present in the newspapers. So remember, anyone who is watching this for the first time, this is the reason, or one of the main reasons why we call it the world exclusive, because it is literally world exclusive. There is no other program from any outlet that is covering these areas and has not covered these areas. And as I was saying at the beginning, this equivalent of these commentaries and evidential findings have been published online when the internet came on. And before the internet came, I have written extensively, and most of my writings have not been published by the Guardian. So they're published only itsy bitsy, or the Times or other papers, or the BBC, but I have written to them extensively. And I mean literally extensively. I have done nothing but write to them, just like I am speaking here. That is what I've been doing for decades. So this is the benefit that anyone watching this, whoever might watch this, either live or afterwards, this is the benefit they should actually pay attention to. This is unique and absolutely important, vital, and the cause is universal justice, fairness, and universal equality and redress before a fair kind of tribunal or system for the people victimized by injustice, either by the state or by the operatives of the state or other forces within the state and within the toleration of the state. Which takes us very briefly in this part to a reference, general reference to what is going on in Bangladesh about the increasing rampant numbers of murders and rapes taking place and violation of women taking place in the country. The reports say that there has been a de facto change in the law about rapists. Anyone watching this would know that we have been calling right from the beginning for rapists not to live in Bangladesh, not to be allowed to live in Bangladesh, and there should not be any rape in Bangladesh. Now, apparently, there has been a law change or change in the law to the effect that rapists would be hanged or given death sentence or capital punishment. That requires an extensive discussion of its own. To what extent that is any difference, the report that there has been a change in the law, and to what extent that will deter the rapists, because the emerging itsy-bitsy revelations in the Bangladeshi quote media is suggesting that the rapists and the other criminals include a large number of collusion and kind of colluders who are either actively in the police force or are known to be operatives and kind of agents of the police and other parts of the state. And there is also, of course, an ongoing, continuing kind of claim by opposition observers that the ruling party is responsible for allowing this to happen, because the ruling party has become a big space, a home for the largest number of criminals in the country who are going without any action being taken against them. Now, that is a very serious state of affairs. And as we have said, independently of whatever is being said in Bangladesh, objectively speaking, was, quote, liberated in December 1971. After months of kind of occupation and armed kind of resistance against the then Pakistan army, which army's members and a number of collaborators with the army committed rapes against the women in what is now Bangladesh, was at the time still East Pakistan. So the fact that in liberated Bangladesh now, women can be raped, gang raped, and sexually violated, and others can be raped in the liberated Bangladesh is completely incompatible with the liberation of Bangladesh and the experience of Bangladesh. That is what we have said. And that is what we meant, and that is what should happen. Whatever the law, no rapist, we are saying, should live in Bangladesh. And no sexually violent criminal must be allowed to go or get away. They must be severely held to account. And that is something that cannot be stressed any more strongly than I'm using this language here. So we shall return to looking at Bangladesh in a detailed way in light of this news about the alleged reported change of law. The reason why we need a longer detailed discussion is because the actual practice in the so-called judicial system and the prosecution system is itself subject to severe questions, because it is considered not objective enough, not impartial enough, and not diligent enough, and not rigorous enough, and not at all interested in upholding justice. That is the reason. So whatever the name of the law, unless the people involved at all these stages are dedicated to opposing the criminals and the crimes, as we have been summarizing, there will be no change. And if there is no change, then there is no Bangladesh at all, because the reason why a country is in existence is to provide the security and safety to the citizens. What is happening in America, the USA has been the leader. Every slogan by the imperialists about America has been that the world's most powerful occupant is in the White House, or a powerful person is in the White House. And that is because of the associated kind of selling point, marketing, that American society is the most fair and most kind of secure for the citizen society. Now, yesterday, when the Young Turks program commentator said that America is a failed state, that cannot be used again because it is a failed state. And Trump, whoever his kind of handlers are or have been, Trump has destroyed that particular myth, that particular line. He has finished the USA. It's not just me saying it. All the commentators who have been looking at the evidence of the last 4 years and increasingly desperate, absolutely, Looney Tunes was the phrase that Ronald Reagan used about Iran and North Korea while Reagan was in the White House. Now, if Reagan were around and observing what Trump has been doing, then he would have to find another phrase to describe Trump, and Looney Tunes would have to be magnified and multiplied 1,000,000 times to begin to convey the lunacy and destruction that Trump has been committing every single time. So we shall be looking at the updates appropriate time, but going back to the first look at the Fleet Street papers today, Thursday, 15th of October 2020. The Times is saying that millions of people are facing lockdown, that is to say, restrictions on the movements. And let's have a look at what it is basing this on. And it's saying the Francis Elliott, political editor, London braced for tougher COVID rules. Socializing and travel restricted. Ministers believe national lockdown looms. Now that was a subject of the exchange between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer yesterday, so-called Prime Minister's questions. And it was Johnson's line that Starmer was changing his position about the extent of the lockdown and the areas that the lockdown covers. And Starmer was disagreeing with that. But essentially, there was no evidence either way. Neither Starmer nor Johnson produced any actual statistics, which is what I have been asking for, that they have to have in the papers, but that applies also to the government's statements and also the statements or the assessment done in the name of the opposition or in the name of any MPs, that there had to be daily reliable information about the contacts with the virus and the various stages the virus goes through or passes through after contact up to the end of the kind of infection, whatever the outcome or whatever the result. And that has not been published in the Fleet Street papers or in the BBC or by the BBC or by the Fleet Street papers or by the opposition MPs. So the serious objection that remains against the allowing of the PMQs to be treated as the definitive kind of exchange between the government and the opposition, that objection remains because it is not yielding information that the public need. There is no information there except accusation, counter-accusation. And each of them, Johnson and Starmer yesterday, kind of pretended to be relying on statistics and evidence. And Starmer actually said something that relates to him being mentioned in the Times yesterday in the editorial, Mayor Culpa, because it said that it's not Starmer that is kind of serving as the tribune of the people, but the regional mayors. And Starmer actually cited a press statement by the mayors. which was done yesterday morning. So they must have been aware of the praise being heaped on them collectively by the Times yesterday before they actually issued the statement. And Starmer completely misunderstood the impact and the implication of the Times dismissing him as being of any relevance whatsoever as the tribune of the people. So he mentioned and he gave additional credence to that scenario, that image of the regional mayors playing the more significant part. Apart from that, of course, I mean, we have been saying that Starmer is not as intelligent as he has been painted to be. And also we have said that Starmer is a careerist. Now, he accused Johnson in retaliation to Johnson's kind of accusation that he was Starmer was changing his position on the lockdown every single day or every other day, or he had done so since Monday. Now, in response to the accusation that he was changing his position, Starmer then accused Johnson of being an opportunist, a lifetime. He had been an opportunist throughout his life. And so therefore it's difficult to kind of get hold of any part of Johnson's cognitive kind of faculties where real facts can be exchanged and laid and kind of treated. Whatever the accuracy of any imagery, the fact is that neither Johnson nor Starmer produced any evidence in terms of where the virus was most active and why. Of course, there was the lump sum, collected, aggregated kind of reference to this area, that area, mainly in the north of England. But they don't say, Johnson didn't say why this was the case. Why was the infection rate higher, so much higher in X, Y, and Z areas as opposed to other areas not far from those areas? What was the factor? Which takes us or brings us back to the role of the newspapers. Why aren't they investigating this? And has any commentator, since yesterday's Prime Minister's questions, PMQs, which happens on Wednesday midday, lunchtime, local time, which is 11 o'clock GMT, has any newspaper or any kind of mainstream so-called media dealt with that gap and that absence? I don't think so, because that is not evident on the front page of the Times and it's not available anywhere else. And what we have seen in the last 9 months is that is the tendency. That the press, the mainstream media, Fleet Street, is copying and acting as a kind of courier agency for whatever comes out of the government's kind of platforms. And yesterday, the Sky News, their political editor, Beth Rigby, was in Manchester area. And despite the fact that there were all these press activities or press-related propaganda activities by the mayors were taking place, there has been nothing of substance to address the issue of why the virus is spreading in particular areas and not spreading in other areas. What is the kind of common set of factors why the virus is spreading in certain areas? And that remains the real job that the media is not doing, either the press or the broadcasting media. So essentially what the press is doing and the Fleet Street is doing and their counterparts in the broadcasting media are doing is repeating propaganda spins and spiels issued by various parties and the government, and tokenistically, because the majority of the time and the space is given to what the government is issuing as propaganda, and token, that is just for the sake of it, not really seriously, tokenistic space is given to the opposition. But regardless of the disparity between the space given and the time given to the government and the opposition, there is a serious absence of evidence that both the government and the opposition are failing to deliver to the people. And when we look at that, the role of the press becomes completely insignificant, useless, because they're not performing the duty. So instead of giving the evidence as to why the virus is spreading and what are the stages that it actually travels from contact to the end of the contact with the person, there is nothing. And that has to be the duty and the urgency that the press and the government and the opposition must address and perform. They must tell the public what is the evidence, and that evidence is lacking. Again, from the government, from the opposition, and from the media. And what the media does in that case is repeat a lot of exchanges between the government and the opposition, which really is not an exchange of fundamental difference in the narrative. Because the opposition, despite the appearance of being critical of the government, is not really critical of the setup. For example, the opposition says that the government has been failing in the trace and test kind of regime, in establishing trace and test regime. And Johnson then defended the government's role and said that it was the best and the most effective one in Europe. This is just spin. There was no evidential sourcing of this claim, either by the opposition in saying the government is failing, which it is, or in the kind of defense of the government's position by Johnson, who was making a bland claim that it was the British test and trace regime was the best in Europe. There was no sourcing, there was no comparison, there was no diagram, there was no numbers as to which countries were favoring or faring worse than the British version, so-called, of the test and trace. Now, which takes us way, way back into the origin of the preparedness of the kind of UK state to protect people at the time of a pandemic. And as I was saying before, months ago, that the pandemonium, that is the chaos and the lack of preparedness and the daily contradictory positions, statements being made by the government, number 10 Downing Street, which is associated with the Prime Minister, and the Matt Hancock, who is the Cabinet Minister in the name of health. I don't say Cabinet Minister for health, because he is not helping health, he is hindering health. So they have not produced any evidential trail, if you like, or the route and the path. They have not shown the various stages of the reasons for the failure to be prepared to meet the challenges of the pandemic. Now, they currently, in the last few weeks, one of the slogans that has been used before as well, but it has been kind of accentuated. It has been given more prominence. It is being given more prominence by Boris Johnson and others in his kind of cabal of government, that the NHS will be overwhelmed if this, that, and the other is not done. But this is the whole point. Why should the NHS be deemed to be incapable of meeting the requirements of the emergency posed by the pandemic, as it is now doing, and it has been doing since the pandemic appeared in Britain? And that is something that the Labour Party is not asking questions about, not as far as I can see, because that is the question that the Labour Party, because it's numerically the second largest kind of party with the second largest numbers of MPs in the House of Commons, which is the main de facto part of the parliament, why is the Labour Party not asking that question? There is a couple of reasons why. One is that the Labour Party doesn't have enough intelligent people in its ranks of MPs, or it is complicit with the same agenda, which is more likely that the Johnson-fronted cabal is kind of pushing effectively, despite the fact that the Labour Party says that it doesn't want the NHS to become victim of the trade deal, post-Brexit trade deal with the USA, and the UK being lumbered with all kinds of suspicious, unsafe, dangerous drugs and whatever from the USA coming to the UK under the guise of Brexit Britain. Despite this clear water slogan, if you like, that is quite clearly different from the Conservatives. Essentially, the Labour Party has not been doing what I have been saying it should have been doing, or any democratic country should have been doing, which is to have the National Health Service, the idea of the National Health Service, ready and prepared to face not only the needs and emergency demands posed by and caused by a pandemic such as the one we are going through, but also to meet the needs of the health needs of other illnesses and other kind of issues about health. And again, that is something that the Fleet Street is totally missing out and leaving out. So let's have a look at the headline. So this headline is millions facing new lockdown. We don't have to read the kind of full copy because it is absolutely without substance and without sourcing. And on the page 2, it says, supermarket rationing did not prevent food shortages during the first months of the pandemic. And here is the shocking news. They are not putting it as shocking because if they treated it as shocking, they would have put it on the front page. Contact trace consultants are being paid £7,000 a day. What on earth for? Why could a consultant, whatever they're consulting on, be paid £7,000 a day? Now, £7,000 a day is almost the salary of many workers in this country, and many kind of NHS primary kind of care and primary level NHS workers, health workers. And nearby, there are other items that we shall be revisiting because we have said the same thing before, but the papers are not really putting it on the front page. This is the one. The government is paying private sector consultants the equivalent of £1 million wages for work on its test and trace system, which is completely proof that the Boris Johnson fronted government is engaged in mass robbery of the public purse and the public kind of being looted to benefit these consultants who are nothing but conservatives, businessmen or businesswomen. Some executives from the Boston Consulting Group helping the government to set up and run its testing system are being paid day rates of about £7,000 equivalent to a salary of about £1.5 million according to Sky News. So that is the evidence. That is the evidence according to Sky News, but they have to go deeper into that. And we are saying, why should it be sourced to Sky News only? Why shouldn't it be part of the daily news as to what the consultants are doing and what use or abuse has been made of the money that has been kind of created, if you like, the borrowings by the government to meet the emergency. What use has the borrowed money or the monetary equivalent been put to? If the newspapers were interested, this revelation would have been available much earlier, and also a lot of this would have been stopped. So that's the diagnosis, and that's the diagnostic finding, that the reason why they don't want to publish this kind of news or to carry out investigation into this kind of abuses is to do with the agenda and the narrative and the politics that the newspapers are in circulation to promote and protect, which is the capitalist exploitation of society in the most kind of brazen way. And that includes the kind of behavior, the attitude exhibited in the behavior of Donald Trump, who has been dancing before a crowd of his so-called supporters and offering to give them all a fat kiss, while in denial of the fact that he has caused hundreds of thousands of people to be killed by this lack of care and whatever in the pandemic. That is the attitude. That is the extreme form of capitalist negligence and disregard for the values of a national health service, the principles of a national health service. And there is a bizarre story in the Times with the headline, "Empty streets make it harder to follow suspects," says the chief of the domestic spying agency MI5 in the UK. Now that is bizarre. And the rest of the Times is not really, it doesn't contain original content. That is the thing. It is full of spin. And what we are looking for in the Times about its origins is the one, it was called the Daily Universal Register. Whether it was called the Daily Universal Register or not at the time, but that is the column that it carries. And it is a kind of insult to the idea of universality, because what appears as the kind of big events under this are not really big. It's just a token kind of column. And the Times is now doing the editorial today advising Johnson to seek Labour Party's cooperation in implementing any kind of program of lockdown, because it seems that the debate or the disagreement between the two parties is over the areas covered by the lockdown and the claim that this is not effective. And the Times has got a letters column, which is a mainly racist letters column, because there is hardly anyone from African or Asian background, and anything other than the status quo issues. Now, there is a difference here today, which has got a letter about inciting racial hatred. And it is a letter that says that the police time should not be used in investigating incitement to racial hatred. And it is typical of the kind of lobby that is going on in this country, rampant pro-racist lobby, which is in defiance of the charters, the agreements, the kind of conventions, the declarations, and the founding aims and objects of the United Nations, which has been celebrating or marking the 75th years of its foundation in the last few weeks. And what is happening is that the media, this is the Times, which is the courier in restrained kind of language, the courier of the same racist agenda that the Daily Mail and others kind of carry. So the Financial Times is running a main front page kind of lead based on the IMF about the austerity not being the inevitable route to restore public finances. So this is a change in the kind of role of the IMF. The role that the IMF has been playing for a very long time, this is a changed tone. So let's say that is all we can say at this stage. And there is a piece in the Financial Times on the opinion page, op-ed page, in opposition to Donald Trump's attacks on the World Health Organization. And the Financial Times is saying, very mildly, an editorial that the Amazon should be paying more tax, and it's not being responsible in avoiding tax, and that kind of thing. So it's not really a paper that carries much about democratic accountability. This is mainly financial kind of insider talk, which is not of any real consequence to the real practices of government, and there is no sign of accountability. Accountability, it's a financial paper. It should be talking about accountability by financial, if you like, giants to the ordinary people, but it doesn't. And as we have said, Beaverbrook's legacy of lying continues apace. In the Daily Express today, it is inventing unbelievably unheard of, unthought of kind of excuse to shore up Boris Johnson. It says jobs crisis. That is jobs crisis when Johnson and the cons are in power or in posts of power. It's a jobs crisis. It won't be as bad as feared. I mean, it would be bad, but not as bad as feared. So it will hang on to any excuse to show that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are much better than the alternative. And there is this double kind of promotion on this spread. 2-page spread on pages 4 and 5, which says UK to bounce back if we escape lockdown. Now that is a kind of double kind of whammy. Can the lockdown be avoided? That's the point. That is the thing that is kind of dominating the so-called dispute. And then on the next spread, 6 and 7, pages 6 and 7, it says that millions more people facing tougher COVID rules to reduce virus spread. So even the Express, in desperation, is contradicting itself from one page to the next or one spread to the next. And then it is continuing with the kind of dire promotion, which it fails to hide the failures of the government. It's a team in race to crack COVID code. I mean, that is failure. That is the failure. And the failure is actually evident right from the beginning, as I have said before, that the state and the powerful positions in the state are intended to be observed by the ordinary people, the citizens, on the assumption that the state is there to protect people. And there is no such kind of important time as when the country is affected by a pandemic. And the pandemic has caught the UK state completely unprepared. And that is where the similarity of the narrative being followed by the Conservative and the Labour appears. Because the Labour Party hasn't been not saying anything about the lack of preparedness, nor has the government. Of course, the government wouldn't when it is in the firing line. So what should be said, and what the newspapers are there to say, but they don't say, is why. Because the newspapers are controlled by criminals who don't want the idea of a national health service to succeed, because they support the private health market. All the newspapers are owned by criminals who support the private health market. Even the Guardian is not fully dedicated to the idea of the National Health Service, nor is the Daily Mirror. And as for the Communist Party Morning Star, which we haven't seen the daily editions of in the last few days, because as I said yesterday, we collect it from an outlet periodically, because it's not kind of cost effective to travel in terms of time and other restrictions that the lockdown and the restrictions kind of cause. So we have to travel a significant distance to get hold of the paper. We pay for it in advance, but we collect it later, than on a daily basis. So, but the Morning Star, even if it had a dedicated kind of loyalty and adherence to the defense of the NHS, it doesn't say the condition, the qualifier, which we say that the idea of the NHS. The Morning Star uses brazenly the NHS, defend our NHS, as Corbyn stupidly and idiotically uses. And in doing that, without any qualification, they let the criminals fleecing and robbing the NHS get away, which applies to local council employees and local councils as well, because there is no requirement for them to be accountable to the public. And Corbyn and his kind of bosses in the Unite Union, for example, Len McCluskey and others of his idiotic ilk, because McCluskey is a very dim, idiotic person. He's not very bright, and he's not intelligent, and he's not ethical. And he has been kind of overly associated with Corbyn by the anti-Corbyn, anti-Labour Party, Fleet Street for many years. Because whatever McCluskey does or say, comes across as being ethically completely unethical, immoral, and his personal life has been splashed all over the place. And that has not helped Corbyn's image at all. So all of these put together are made even worse by the fact that neither McCluskey nor Corbyn has made any point of holding the employees in local councils or in the NHS accountable to the public, ordinary people who are not members of the NHS, staff or employed by the councils. That has been the serious flaw and remains the serious flaw. It's not socialistic to excuse negligent people under the cover of socialism. And the biggest failure of the trade union barons and criminals running and controlling the agenda of the collective images of the trade unions has been to cover for these hundreds of thousands or millions of employees in the public sector who are allowed exemption from accountability. I hope this point has been clear because it is a very significant central issue of the failure. So there is no discussion by the Labour Party, either fronted by Corbyn or now by Starmer, about why the UK National Health Service of the UK state was caught unawares, unprepared to deal with the virus and the infection. And that applies to all organs of the state. And we shall be now looking at the general headlines. Tougher lockdown by end of the week. That is the I newspaper. So it's the same kind of artificial kind of rehashing of the press releases and press lines. As I said yesterday again, this is actually made available to the kind of press or the Fleet Street, which are subscribers of the Press Association's news service. The Press Association is the main domestic kind of organ that retails the official news lines to most of the newspapers. So therefore, there is a similarity. They don't have original, so they sit there. Either they're working remotely from home, these so-called journalists, they sit there in front of their screens and they copy the stuff and they make kind of in-house insertions to make it look like their own organ. They're carrying the same kind of copy or the main story, but giving it a gloss to make it look like their in-house style. Now they must think that the people are so stupid. I mean, they won't notice. And in fact, they are correct. Most of the gullibles that consume these papers don't think of these factors. So they buy them and they buy the line and the lies. And this is why this world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street is absolutely exclusive. We are making this available, this various kind of stages of corruption and denial and suppression of the truth. And here is the kind of proof of the corruption of the BBC money. It says the BBC chairman post gets £60,000 pay rise. It's not the main pay, it's the amount by which they will get extra £60,000 on top of their salary, the new salary. So the former Daily Telegraph editor Charles Moore, the government's preferred choice, is said to have withdrawn his interest after demanding £280,000 to take on the post. Now, why would he demand £280,000? What has he got to offer? Charles Moore is a proven liar and a racist and an idiot. Now, anyone can look up his work and can find that he is full of idiocies and stupidities. He's not worth even £100,000, not even £50,000 of license fee payers' money. But anyway, whoever gets the thing is going to get £60,000 extra. That's what the I newspaper is saying. But it's not based on investigation. It is not analyzing the role of the chairman of the BBC. Independently reporting, it is not. And then there is a side story about Naga Manchetti. And it's saying that she is to replace Emma Barnett as host of the mid-morning program on BBC Radio 5 Live. Barnett is leaving the role to become the main presenter of Radio 4's Women's Hour. So that is the game they're playing with the license fee payer money. License fees are paid by ordinary people who are kind of exploited by the BBC, abused by the BBC, because license fee payers and the so-called consumers of the BBC services have no forum. There is no accountability to the license fee payers. And so the contents of the BBC, the editorial lines and everything else should be made, and we are saying this exclusively here. Something I said 30 years ago, but this is an updated version. 30, 40 years ago I said in the 1980s when I spoke at a kind of short seminar on the media held at the London School of Economics. And I spoke as the main kind of speaker, and I said that the BBC should be scrapped. Without democracy, without accountability, the BBC should be scrapped. Not because the BBC should be scrapped because it wasn't capitalist enough. I said it was too capitalist and too unaccountable. And one of the things that the BBC has failed to do is to uphold this value that a state should be prepared. The state should be prepared to protect its citizens at a point like the emergency posed by the pandemic COVID-19. The BBC has not, in fact, the BBC has been secretive in hiding various misdeeds of the government over the decades. Especially, the BBC has been instrumental in keeping secret the various nuclear war preparations that the British state has been engaged in. And the main kind of investigative report was published mainly under the initiative of Duncan Campbell, not the Duncan Campbell, similar name, who is either a partner or married to Julie Christie. It's the Duncan Campbell who is the other Duncan Campbell, who is an investigative reporter, journalist. And he was one of the defendants in the 1970s in the court case that the Labour government brought against the journalists, an investigative soldier called ABC, Aubrey, Berry, and Campbell. ABC is the kind of tag that will bring up results if anyone searches under ABC trial. And Duncan Campbell was the C of the ABC. And Aubrey was Crispin Aubrey, whom I knew as a reporter on the Time Out magazine at the time in the 70s. I contributed to Time Out in the 70s, but that is another story I shall be updating on in due course. Now, that other Duncan Campbell was associated with the Time Out, and he racistly gave me a guideline as to how to write about the East End of London, about Brick Lane and what was going on in there. I shall update on his racist role and racist role of others concerned. But going back to the ABC and the investigative journalism and the role of the BBC in telling the truth to the public about the government. So Duncan Campbell published a series of reports, mainly starting with the New Statesman, although the New Statesman is a right-wing corrupt outfit, and it had been all the time. This was an exceptional moment when Duncan Campbell actually used the New Statesman to publish the report about the BBC's hiding the government's nuclear secrets or nuclear war secrets. And the main thing was that the information that Duncan Campbell published referred to the government's preparation to ignore mass deaths of the civilian population in the case of a nuclear war. And the BBC hid that fact and the BBC banned the publication of the documentary that had been done by others long before Duncan Campbell actually got involved in the investigation about the cover-up. Now, the BBC, therefore, has not been at all telling the truth about the big issues that affect the big numbers of casualties and big numbers of peoples affected by denials of service and due protection by the state. This is something that needs to be corrected. And the BBC taxpayers or license fee payers should have the say, not the government, as to what happens to the BBC's agenda and its accountability and its duty and the role. So this is just a kind of short statement of who should actually govern and control the BBC, not the government. And the BBC is not to be trusted unless the license fee payers and ordinary voters, ordinary people in the country have the say as to what happens to the license fee money, what happens to the agenda, who sets the agenda, and who actually decides what is news and what is not news. The society and the world has moved far away from the time of the 1960s and 70s, when the BBC could be doing this kind of corruption and hiding. Now, as the pandemic has actually exposed the societies everywhere, this is a moment, and this is an exclusive saying here, where the ordinary definition of the state, ordinary definition of the parliament, ordinary definition of the media, mainstream media, has been completely suspended. And it has been suspended or defied most starkly by Donald Trump. So he's an imposter occupying the post that is otherwise overrated and described as the world's most powerful post. And as Nancy Pelosi has said, not that I am a fan of Nancy Pelosi, but this is a factual statement that she made months ago, or even more than a year ago. She said that Trump is a criminal who belongs in prison. He's committing daily crimes, and the most vicious crimes that he has been committing is to deny service by the state to the citizens and to deny due process in the behavior of the state towards the citizens. And that is something that applies to the media as well, because the media, despite the evidence, the media has been failing to investigate this phenomenon. And even after Nancy Pelosi said it more than a year ago, or said words to the effect more than a year ago, if not the exact phrase, the media, including the so-called Washington Post, of course owned by Jeff Bezos now, but Washington Post prides itself, based on that story about all the president's men, the two reporters that investigated Nixon. The Washington Post actually kind of over exploiting that image and association. So it claims to be opposed to Trump. But the Washington Post has not been doing the investigation into Trump. It's the New York Times that has been doing more investigative reporting. Not enough, but it's the New York Times that has been doing more investigative reporting about Trump than the Washington Post. And there has been nothing from the equivalents like the LA Times or Chicago Tribune or all the others in the region. And there is no kind of traction in any investigation done by any of the television channels, although the channels are, there are many channels and many slots across the USA that have content based on Trump's behavior daily, that are critical of Trump, but there is nothing that actually amounts to original investigation. Most of the people who have been kind of disclosing the secrets about what goes on in the Trump White House have been other people, including one of the reporters from the Washington Post that did the investigation into Nixon. And this shows that the media in the USA is as bad, as lazy, and as kind of corruptly controlled by big business, which is the case. Jeff Bezos, I mean, he couldn't be more crooked and more dishonest, even if he tried to. I mean, this news item this week, doing the rounds in the UK, that Bezos has been not paying enough digital tax, which is rubbish. Even if he paid or didn't pay digital tax, doesn't matter. He is dodging big time sums, and he is actually being allowed to operate a kind of fleecing business, fleecing the customer without any control whatsoever. And that applies to Facebook, that applies to Apple computer and all the big techs as well. So none of the government, none of the printed media is bothering about investigating these. And the connections among government and big business is brazenly open there, but the preppers are not investigating. And the fact that Murdoch is not bothered about the crisis, health crisis, governance crisis in this country is in this item. What is the point of running this story about this Philip Schofield talking about the moment he lost it? I mean, what's the point? What is the point? And the point is that the scum is kind of living the legend and the notoriety that it is scum. It doesn't care about the people and telling the truth about society to its readers. And it's a semi-pornographic mode. It has been pornographic, but it is semi-pornographic today. And it has got other semi-pornographic stories, mainly featuring kind of sexual items that nothing to do with the society really. And here is the Guardian, which we didn't look at yesterday because the outlet didn't have the Guardian yesterday. So it has got, this is an outrageously stupid, more stupid than racist item on the top of the page. Top of the page, not the main story, but the top of the page is, because this is the month of October when in Britain there is a racist ritual observed by local councils mainly and some other kind of similar organizations, and they call it the Black History Month. Now, Black History Month is to be kind of lauded, but what goes on is not about Black history, as I have said before. It's about a distorted version and approach to some of the Black events. And the main thrust is to avoid racism, discussing racism in the here and now. That's what goes on in the month of October. But we should be talking about the need to observe a month of action against racism. That would be relevant and that would be original. The Black History Month was set up by a number of people that were funded by the Greater London Council, fronted by the coup leader Ken Livingstone. And that is a highly kind of unaccountable operation that was. And the Black History Month is therefore consequently highly kind of confusing and contradictory affair. It's not about fighting racism. It's not about fighting imperialism. It's not about fighting the corruption inherent in the successor to the so-called end of the empire. And the Guardian sketch writer John Crace, as I have said before, is kind of doing his best to kind of come across as critical of Johnson. But he's not succeeding because he is under constraint from Catherine Vayner, the editor of The Guardian. And this is about 20 items, separate items in The Guardian today that only reinforce the finding that the state is unprepared, unready to provide service in an emergency. Now, this Guardian, today's Guardian says that councils, that is local borough councils, have been ordered or told to prepare for space or beds for the people who have been discharged from formal hospitals after undergoing treatment for COVID-19. Now, that is not the duty of the councils in the current setup. And that shows that there is a kind of disconnection between the duties of the local council to its own citizens and people and what the actual realities are of the behavior of the councils, and which takes us back to the discussion about the lack of accountability by local councils that we had in the 4 editions yesterday when we diagnosed the stupid editorial mea culpa or mea culpa in the Times. Whether the council system, so-called, is based on leader and committees, or whether it's a mayor-led or mayor-controlled council system, makes no difference if there is no accountability. And our objection to having a mayor is that once you have a mayor, then whatever pretense of holding the mayor to account by the elected councillors or holding the leader to account by the elected councillors disappears completely, as has happened in Newham, as has happened in Tower Hamlets, as has happened in Lewisham and in Hackney. But the Hackney's current mayor is a craftier self-promoter than the others because he comes in with the most trendy kind of utterances, which are without any substance, but he does that, he gets in with a trendy utterance about an issue. But essentially, local councils across the country are under attack from the conservatives on the one hand, and by their own evidence of irrelevance to the local communities and their failure to engage in behaving democratically, accountably, and fairly to the kind of needs of the people in their boroughs. In the case of Tower Hamlets, for example, we have discussed before the systematic robbery of millions of pounds by the in-house youth service in place in Tower Hamlets Council, in-house youth service. And they stole money, millions of pounds. And the theft included money, according to privatized interpretation, that was allocated by the UK central government to fight radicalization of youngsters, young people. To what extent that is kind of acceptable as an agenda is another matter, but the fact is that the council, Tower Hamlets Council, allowed millions of pounds to be stolen by a gang of criminals who made it impossible for any services to benefit from that money that they stole. And to this day, there is no indication that any of the criminals actually implicated in that crime or that series of crimes is going to face any prosecution. Think about that. And in the years of the theft and the robbery, according to the claim made by a former employee of the Owners Council, who took the council to the industrial tribunal or a tribunal claiming unfair dismissal, he actually mentioned a death threat issued against another person who was objecting to the criminality. And again, despite that fact being made in the process of his court hearing, no prosecution, so far as I can see, has been reported about anybody connected with that threat or that kind of series of threats. So the councils and Townless Council failed to, of course, prevent, prevent is the word, prevent the three girls, Shamima and her two friends, both of whom have now died, from becoming involved, whatever way they got involved. And so therefore they were not safeguarded from being radicalized and suicidally, destructively so. So the Townless Council has got a long list of failures to safeguard children. Quite apart from that particular kind of series of references there, Townless Council also failed to safeguard the children of a special needs school called Ian Mikado, where there are reports of many children being exposed to negligence by the management, including the fact that they were lumbered with a convicted racist killer of Shiblu Rahman to be employed in the school. Again, this happened during the time of the council being a mayor-led or mayor-controlled council. So on every kind of issue of needs, local councils are failing the local communities, as happened in, of course, spectacularly in the massacre of the Grenfell Tower residents, whereby the Kensington and Chelsea Council, which is the local controlling council, controlled by the Conservatives, allowed the massacre to be possible by years of neglect and lying and corruption in the various stages of its involvement in the building, in the building's safeguarding or whatever. And in Southwark Council allowed a dangerous building structure to be set on fire and the people to be killed. And all of these are only tips of the icebergs, if you like, of the failures of the local councils. And the arrangement in this country, in the UK, or especially in England, entails local councils being the deliverers of services, much of which is funded by central government funding. For example, welfare benefits, housing benefits, and so on. But the corruption and the lack of accountability transcends difference in forms of government or structure of government in the local councils. So we have discussed this again, and there is no evidence of newspapers covering this. Fleet Street doesn't recognize any of this, and yet these are the realities of the situation that people every day experience. Now, there is a farcical continuation by the Daily Star of its joking kind of treatment of the pandemic, and this time it's featuring the man who apparently controls Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings. And it says that Cummings and his family in Durham are kind of avoiding council tax. Well, this is the kind of Cummings that has become a joke figure after his serial violation of the lockdown. And that is the context against which this report of his family avoiding paying council tax has traction, if there is a traction in that story. But the fact that they're talking about evading council tax does not mean that they are talking about the council's own failures. And we shall be talking more about Durham Council later. And the Daily Mail today says, well, it has got a sex kind of section on the top of page 1. And it says that the husband says his wife should feel guilty for going off sex. Now, I mean, that how important is that when it comes to the problems that people have? I mean, how important is that? And the main thing is that the proof lockdown tears the heart out of Britain. So what they're doing is they're kind of promoting the same agenda that the others in Fleet Street are kind of promoting. That is the kind of thing against the lockdown being imposed more widely than it has been so far, and especially lockdown being imposed in areas that are now in the news because of the effect that they say, negative effect that the lockdown has on their lives. But again, this is not about preparation by the services to avoid the need for any lockdown. That is the point I'm making. Where are the preparations? Because, as I said, there is no evidential route, there is no details, there is no facts as to why the thing spreads and how people are contacting it. How many people are contacting and where, and who are the sources of the information. And they are now kind of attacking the Daily Mail. They're attacking Starmer's call for lockdown by boosting the image of Rishi Sunak. And they're again attacking Matt Hancock as a petulant, ignorant minister, which is a rare thing for the Daily Mail to call a Tory minister. And it has got another rare piece on the Scousers, the Liverpool incidents, where armed police fining gym owners £1,000. I mean, this is a rare piece because the people of Liverpool and the Northeast are not treated as equal by the Daily Mail. So they are trying to catch up. And then there is this other front pages, care homes for the COVID cases. Frail patients will isolate in 500 special units across country to stop a wave of winter deaths. Now, it doesn't say anything about the attitude of the staff in the care homes. And there is no report, there hasn't been any report since the large numbers of deaths in care homes as to how many deaths could have been avoided if the staff there were treating them properly. Here we actually cite the case of the central importance of the staff in care homes or hospitals, as illustrated by the incident in Canada, where a First Nation woman was laughed at as she was dying, laughed at by the nurses that were supposed to save her. If that is the attitude that was involved, and it is the most likely factor in the failure of the care home patients to be treated in time or at all, then of course many people have been murdered, these patients. And the newspapers are not talking about that at all. They have not talked about that at all. Fleet Street, I mean. So we'll be continuing on the theme in the next edition, which is edition B, in a little while.